with you. We have a poll, so we'll do that a little bit later on. We may not be able to do that too, so we might have to just engage, because we expect to be in a forum where you all would be on another side of the screen, but we see that we have engagement opportunities. So we'll be looking forward to all of you all engaging with us. So I am Dr. Talisa Sullivan, and Dr. Emery is going to introduce herself, but I wanted to share that I'm the creator of the Quantum 10 Equity Framework, and we will talk to you a little bit more about that in a little bit later on in the presentation. So thank you. Emery, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So you all already see our bios in that wonderful app that I've been having so much fun playing around in. But I wanted to let you know that though I'm currently the Student Support and Academic Achievement Coordinator with the Problem Solving Response to Intervention Project, which is housed in the University of South Florida College of Education in their Institute of School Reform. So yes, that does all have a world of acronyms that goes around it, but essentially I dedicate my work to advocating for equity in education across the state of Florida. And I've been doing that work for a few years now. Prior to that, I was in school improvement as an assistant director of school improvement for the Southwest region. So something you may not know about me that's not in my bio, I was like thinking about it today. So I wrote down a couple of things, and I've been advocating for neurodiverse learners since I was a child, because I had a childhood friend who was dyslexic. And at that time, inclusion wasn't a part of schooling. And so the work from the CAST Institute with David Rose really catapulted my interest in the neurosciences and equity. And I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Yes, we connected recently as we're developing a conference regarding equity, Quantum 10. And a little bit more about me that is not in my bio either is that I've been doing equity work for longer than I remember what equity was. And so started when I first started teaching and not sure what to call it, but wanted to make sure that everyone had everything that they needed and not just giving everybody the same exact thing. So we thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to talk to you a little bit about transforming the systems of single best practices in equity and education. And we're really going to specifically talk about an integrated approach. And Emery has we have a data survey that we want to do a little bit of collection from you. So if you can take the opportunity to either put the bit.ly into your URL browser, you can also scan it on the QR code. I will drop it in the chat as well. So we want to give you an opportunity to do that. Emery, do you want to go ahead and talk a little bit more about this, the survey that we're doing?
Yeah, if you all just wouldn't mind, like she said, tagging that QR code, or we put the link in the chat box. It'll take maybe 3 to 5 minutes at the most. And the survey focuses on adaptive leadership, specifically data practices. And what you're going to learn about as we proceed is Q10 encompasses 2 theories and 5 frameworks and 3 practices. But within those, we have our own little theory of practice, and that is that when it's fused together, then the related policies and practices and processes and professional learning will transform our educational systems through equity for all. And we'll do that in opportunity, in access, engagement, and in success. So where do we start? Well, we're going to fuse those Q10 within common practices, and that's referred to as the core 4, which Talisa is going to share more information with you about soon. But adaptive leadership is one of those Q4. So we're just going to give you a little flavor of the work that we are doing with equity. And we'll bring those results back at the end. So while you're all doing that, I'm going to do a check-in to see how we're doing.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next slide while you're doing your survey. We're going to give you a little bit of time to kind of complete the survey. And as you're completing the survey, I'm just going to give a little bit about the overview on what we're going to be doing today. of course, we're going to do a little bit of introductions. We're going to have you guys tell us who you are in just a moment, where you're from. We'll give you that slide in just a moment. We're going to tell you our objectives. So before we move forward with the presentation, what we would love for you to take from this session, we're going to define MTSS. Anne-Marie will take us through something where she'll have an opportunity to work with you on defining MTSS. We will talk about the purpose, the ESSA purpose. I will dive into what is Quantum 10. I will also take us through the elements of Quantum 10, and as Anne-Marie mentioned, the core 4. We will talk also about the phases of the Quantum 10, and then Anne-Marie will tell you about the virtual conference that's coming up soon in December. We'll have an opportunity to give you a chance to ask questions and hopefully give you some answers, and then we will also take another survey at the end of the presentation. So thank you, guys. So moving on, what we would love to have from you in the chat, and if some of us really love the chat, somebody can unmute if you'd like to, but maybe not at once, but we'd love your name, the role, an interesting fact, and what is your hope for education? So we would love some of that in the chat. I'd love to hear someone's voice to tell us what their hope for education is. We're going to take a pause to kind of get that going in the chat, and we'll read some of it out.
And Talisa, while people are introducing themselves in the chat, I wanted to let you know I looked in the app just before we were beginning, and we have people from all different roles and walks of life. We have public and private education sector people, departments of education, school leaders, educational agencies, classroom educators, educational coordinators, counselors and case managers, and even doctoral students. So quite a variety.
Wow, well, thank you. Thank you for engaging in the app. So as we're going through, if you'd like to unmute and kind of tell us who you are, we'd love to hear from at least 1 or 2 voices, and then everyone else, you guys can go ahead and start filling the chat.
So we have a few good mornings in the chat, and then we also have some introductions from Elise from the Reconnection Services at Portland Public Schools. And Annie gave me a message about the survey really gives her a sharp focus on all the things that our data isn't doing. So you're in the right session with us, girlfriend. We are going to really have some conversations about that. And then Lorna is from Fast Buffalo Horse Multiple Pathways to Graduation Director from Portland. Welcome.
Perfect.
We've got a lot of technology going on here, Talisa. Like I'm all over the place.
I see. I was hoping that we would be able to get some engagement in this chat, but I forgot that it goes through Hoover. So thank you for doing that, Anne-Marie. And I'm not sure if you can unmute at this point, because I remember I was in a session earlier and I was not able to unmute. So we thank you for your comments in the Hoover app. Anything else, Anne-Marie, before we move on?
No, we can go ahead and keep going.
All right, let's go. So again, the objectives, we told you about the overview of the objectives. So we're going to discuss ESSA and MTSS. We are going to talk about the intentional integration of the Quantum 10 that we will share with you what that is in just a bit. Hopefully you'll learn about the Quantum 10, the Equity in Education Framework, and the Equity in Education Conference that's coming up in December on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. And then we're going to explore the elements. We're going to explore the phases of the Quantum 10, and we will also talk a little bit about the continuum. Okay, so this quote is a quote that I really wanted to kind of share with you all. And it was kind of the inspiration of the Quantum 10, one of the inspirations of the Quantum 10. So our society cannot afford a two-tiered system in which affluent have access to superior education while everyone else is subjected to a dull and incoherent classroom experience. Academic excellence, educational equity, and fairness demand a strong foundation of knowledge for all learners. And that really resonates with me because I know that there are some of us here that already know that there are kind of 2 tracks, 2 systems. We have systems for those that have the experience, have the knowledge, and are able to guide their students through or their children through. And then there's another track where if you don't have the experience, if you don't have the information, sometimes you don't quite get there. And so we're just saying that we don't have our students, our children can't afford that type of two-tiered system. And so the Quantum 10 kind of like reels that in and says, let's give equity and access to all students, regardless of their background, their historical background. So we're looking forward to kind of exploring with you. And I'll kind of tell you more about the inspiration after Anne-Marie goes through and gives you a little bit more about the Every Student Succeeds Act and the multi-tier systems of support.
Okay. So sorry, guys, I was checking in on the survey and 8 of you have completed it. I thank you. It's going to be really intriguing for us to go through and look at it as if you were working with a group or looking to improve your practices for data within your adaptive leadership. So moving into Every Student Succeeds Act and ESSA. The provisions for ESSA began to include and benefit all of our students, right? We wanted to make sure that not only students with disabilities, but those that were homeless, low-income students, students of color, English language learners, all are afforded the same opportunity for learning. The backstory to all of that began when Ruby Bridges attended school for the first time in 1960. And then another timeline moment was when students with disabilities were entered and allowed into public education settings in 1975. Well, in 1984, David Rose at the Center for Applied and Special Technology thought, why are we struggling so much with just access? And started looking at the proactive versus the reactive lens of meeting the needs of all of our students. And so he has a great talk. If you type it into YouTube, you can find it real quickly, where he talks about we want learning to have no limits, so we have to build systems that allow for that. And he uses pictures of schools and how difficult it was just to get physical access for students who had visually identifiable disabilities into the school systems, and how now we build our schools in a way that that isn't an issue anymore. But what is an issue in our schools is that we're still teaching in many ways the same way that we learned when we were in school, and our world has changed so much. So now it's more of a curriculum disability than it is a access to the physical building. It's about access to the different ways that people learn, the different values that people bring to the learning. And that's really important to keep in mind, because that's where those 4 major provisions within ESSA came from. We, at a minimum, want to make sure that all students have higher order skills available to them, because we know that in order for them to have those higher order skills, they have to have it to be able to understand, and understanding takes them to that application. So we also want to make sure that there's multiple measures to assess school performance and progress. We don't learn the same way, and so we can't use one measure. And unfortunately, I'm in the state of Florida, where we have high stakes testing, and it really does curtail the opportunities that some are allowed or afforded. Resource equity is another issue. Equality and equity are not the same thing. So just because I have pencils in my classroom for all my students, it doesn't mean that there's equity, because some of my students may not need pencils. They might need grippers on their pencils. They might need a different writing tool altogether. They might need to be able to speak into a computer for their knowledge to be shared. So resource equity doesn't mean giving everyone the same thing. It means ensuring that everyone has what they need to be able to do the best that they can. And those equity strategies and evidence-based interventions We can really get bogged down in what is sufficient instead of what's efficient in this area. And what I mean by that is just because something is evidence-based doesn't mean that it is appropriate for the particular groups of students or for all of the students in your classroom. It's not a one size fits all with a different program, and it's how those programs are integrated into the work that the teachers are doing side by side with the students to meet their needs. So ESSA brings a lot to the table, and how it relates to the Q10 is 8 of the Q10 elements are within ESSA. And Talisa's going to share more about that. But what's important is to know that of those 8, they all fall within, like in the state of Florida, we work within 6 critical components of our multi-tiered system of support. And that is looking not at instruction and intervention in isolation or siloed from each other, but looking at them in how they work and complement each other. Looking at database problem solving in relationship to the multi-tiers of instruction and intervention. And what is it telling us about our students? Not admiring what it's telling us isn't happening, but how is it allowing us to problem solve to make every opportunity better? Leadership is a stronghold for our critical components because it really speaks to how engaged and active in that collective efficacy that we want from everyone who's working with our students. Then capacity building and infrastructures are essential because we know that we work in a field that is of transitions. It's either people come and leave. We have in Florida, we have a 3-year timeline on most of our educators. They come in and within 3 years, they're burnt out and leave. But we also have an internal system where if we have someone who is in our system and is stellar at their work, they get promoted and go and work in a different role or a different capacity. And so how do we have a system for building capacity and an infrastructure that supports those practices to stay true, so that we can have equity in our education? Communication and collaboration and data evaluation are also within those 6 critical components. So the way that we look at it is we think of it as in the ESSA provisions plus an MTSS or multi-tiered system of support equals those Q10 fusions through the policies, practices, procedures, and professional learning that we use to deepen the offerings for all students for universal education. So I'm going to pass it over to Talisa now, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about the Q10.
Yeah, so I know that you've heard Dr. Anne-Marie speak of the Q10 a couple times, and the question is like, what is this Q10? It's actually a new framework, so I'm going to go over that with you. You also heard her talk about integration, and that's one of the things with the Quantum 10. We're really talking about the integration of the elements that you see before you, and I'm going to go ahead and list them out in case, I don't know, maybe you can see the graphic, but you can see clearly the ones that we all know very well. And so it's not new. They're not new to education. We've always known that you have to Maslow before you bloom. We've all known that you need to make sure that our students have their physiological needs before we can go anywhere else. We also all know that if teachers and educators don't have a growth mindset, then whatever mindset they do have is possibly being imposed upon their students. And so those are just a couple of the elements. And those are actually the 2 that are not specifically endorsed, I'll say, by the Every Student Succeeds Act, but those are the 2 that are interwoven into every single one of the elements of the Quantum 10. And so all of the other quantum are definitely evidence-based. And so I want to share that with you out loud as we talk about it. But what we're saying is that when you fuse them together, it becomes a holistic approach to ensuring that all of our students have everything that they need. So what is Quantum 10? It is the fusion of 10 different theories, frameworks, and practices that together focus on enhancing that educational equity. So I want to tell you a little bit more about, as you saw the slide that had the kind of the cartoonish girl sleeping, I'm going to tell you where the thought process came from behind the Quantum 10. And so this is the framework that I did develop, and it was based on working across 4 counties. So I've worked across 4 counties in education, and prior to working in education, I worked with my mom who owned her own center, childcare center. And so looking at different siloed evidence-based practices, watching some students thrive because if they have some sort of trauma that they've experienced, but providing them with those resources and having teachers that are trauma trained, trauma-informed trained, really benefits those students. Then my brain process is, what about the students who have behavioral challenges? Are those students really still experiencing practices that are beneficial for them to thrive also? So I can go on through all of the elements to talk about restorative practices and response to intervention, and see if we're practicing one of the elements versus all of them in tandem, what students are benefiting. And so what you see before you is the Quantum 10, and a little later on in the presentation, I'll go deep into the core 4. So again, here you see the quantum, and we'll look at them very closely in the next slide. So before we go on, I wanted to give you had an opportunity to see the visual. Now you have an opportunity to see the actual words, the social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, the response to intervention, the inclusive practices, and the list goes on. Which of these elements, and you can just put it in the chat, and Dr. Anne-Marie will be reading out that chat from the Whova app. Which of these elements are evident in your school or district? That's the first question we're going to ask. So we'd love to see that. We were going to do a poll, but we don't have the capacity with the Whova app. So we'll do it in the app. Which of these elements are evident in your school or district? So we have social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, universal design for learning, response to intervention, positive behaviors, interventions, and supports, restorative practices, culturally responsive practices, inclusive practices, growth mindset, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We'll just wait for you all to put those in the Whova app. Emery, let us know when we got some interaction in our Whova app.
Yeah, we've got I just had a whole bunch of things pop in, so give me 1 second.
All right.
Okay, we have TIP, RTI, RP, CRP, and GM. So growth mindset, to code this through for people. Growth mindset, we have culturally responsive practices, restorative practices, response to intervention, as well as trauma-informed practices present.
Okay. Okay, great. So one of the things with the quantum, as you see the elements on the screen, our push is for these elements to be integrated intentionally. So if we're having all of those practices, that's great, because we're saying they're evidence-based. I'm so proud to hear that you all are practicing some of the quantum, I'll say. Now what we want to talk about is how are they intentionally being integrated in your school or your institution? So that's a question that you can kind of think about. Sometimes it's kind of hard to answer, but most times people already know that they're integrating it, but some of us don't know that we're already integrating it. However, I do know that you are, because that's the very nature of equity in education. So on the next slide, my screen is taking a minute to come up, but it is, oh, that wasn't what I hoped for, but that's okay. Give me 1 moment. I'm really sorry. Technical difficulties. We will be presenting. So I'm going to open up the core 4. This is in the center of the graphic that we just looked at. We just kind of pulled it out some so that you can see. The core 4 is the foundation for building the capacity of the educators to be well equipped with the students that are in need of qualified teachers, with mastery of instructional practices that incorporate all of those elements. So the elements of the core 4 are the high quality instruction. And so when we talk about high quality instruction, we're talking about, of course, we know that teachers need to build relationships. You know, Rita Pearson, the late Rita Pearson, I should say, you know, her quote was, kids don't learn from people they don't like. And so we do know that the relationship piece is important. However, that's not the only piece with high quality instruction. We need to make sure that our teachers are well trained and that they're able to really deliver the content. The other one that I talk about is parent and community engagement. And I know that a lot of us are like, well, we engage our parents, which is great. And I love that. We want to go one step further than just having them come to the school for a coffee with the principal, or even just the community events that we have once or twice a year, or parent teacher conference. My thought process is, when you're looking at the quantum, if you're thinking about a trauma informed, a student that's experiencing trauma, how are we engaging our parents with that piece? And to go a little bit further with that is, if the student is experiencing some trauma, what type of resources are we providing for the parents in order to be able to help them understand what their students are experiencing? So that's beyond the coffee with the principal. And then also, we all have jobs and we're all working in the educational system because of our students. And so the days of the sage on the stage are over, and we need to be engaging our students in a student-centered culture. And that goes beyond, you know, that goes in addition to their culture, their language, you know, whatever it is that is going to engage them culturally. We want to look at their environment. We want to be able to bring those cultures into the classroom so that students understand that this is about you and not about me.
So Talisa,
do you have any questions before we move forward?
I just wanted to add, before you move forward, that I always continuously go back to my work in school improvement, and we did a lot of work with the 5 elements out of the University of Chicago, and that we held on tight and true to and saw play through with the improvement of the schools and districts was that these 4 areas that you have here were represented in those 5 elements. And when you bring 3 of those practices to a sustaining or transforming level, doesn't even have to be like the highest level. It can be transforming on our continuum that we're going to share next. You have tenfold the impact on your students increasing and accessing and having equity in their education than if you are trying to peg away and tick things off one at a time. So we can't work just at our high quality instruction in silo from parent and community engagement, or in silo from our adaptive leadership skills and abilities, or our student-centered cultures.
Thank you, Emery. And just so that you see, again, the center is the core. And so I'm going to go back to the graphic a little bit, but before I do that, I want you all to see the opportunity, access, engagement, and the success. And so what we're saying is, with the quantum, and I'm going to go back to the, I'm going to try to go back. There it is. With this quantum, if you could take a look now at the whole image together, you see the quantum 10 around, you know, the wheel. I'll call it a wheel. You see it around the wheel, and that is really what we're asking for schools and districts to kind of push and say, let's do these in tandem so that we can represent providing that equity and access for more than just the students that are that have experienced trauma, or the students that are experiencing behavioral challenges. We're looking at all of the different students that have experienced, whether it's challenges with, you know, adapting to our system, because in our American system, we have forced people to assimilate to American culture, just so that we know. And so what happens if we don't provide them with those scaffolds and those supports to be able to adjust and to really be able to construct meaning the way they know how, then what we're doing is we're setting them up for not success. I'll say that. And so with this, the core 4, which is the blue part, drive the quantum. Without the core, the quantum kind of are still evidence-based, but who's going to make sure that they get into the classrooms, into the schools, and make sure that they're practiced with fidelity? So we're saying that this is a whole package. Again, so Emery mentioned she mentioned the continuum. And so these are the phases on the continuum. And so one of the things, as I was developing the framework, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't, there is no deficit in this continuum. So that was one of the thought processes behind creating the framework. No deficit. You're exploring, you're emerging, you're transforming, you're advancing, or you're sustaining. And pretty much what that means is that you could be, and you can see the arrows that are going backwards and forwards on the continuum. You could be anywhere on this continuum with any of the elements, and you're not in a deficit model. You're in an exploring model if you haven't explored, let's say PBIS. A lot of times with PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, a lot of people believe that that's only for the elementary. And we are at a RAPSA conference where we are working with students that are most at need students that are sometimes dumped into the alternative ed systems and don't have all the resources. And so we're sitting here and we're looking like we have our alt ed students don't necessarily benefit from PBIS, but they do. And so PBIS is really just like a system that provides that, what do I want to say, the expectations. But PBIS by itself could kind of seem a little bit controlling. And that's why you want to make sure that you're implementing, restorative practices, trauma-informed practices, and a lot of the other elements that go along with that to not make it so teacher-driven or expectations-driven. We still have to make sure that with those expectations, you have that restorative practices in case expectations are not met. So you could be a little informed and be in the exploring phase, but not be deficit in PBIS. So I just want us to kind of see that. So as far as exploring, this is where the inquiry begins. And that's exactly what the exploring is. We have a cooperative team effort that examines the practices and procedures of professional learning. And this is just like your beginning stages. You haven't quite figured out whether you're going to be, heading into the quantum or not, but you're just kind of exploring the idea. You're emerging into an agreed upon continuous cycle of improvement. And so what we want you to hear is the continuous cycle of improvement, because without that continuous cycle, and that will go through all of the phases, you're constantly plan, do, study, act, constantly plan, do, study, act. We move over on the continuum to emerging, and this is where teams kind of start to become, after exploring, they become coordinated and they start to develop a cycle. Okay, so before you're just exploring the cycle, now you're developing that cycle of continuous improvement. We're moving into transforming. As you move into transforming, teams begin to expand on their thinking. They begin to develop proficiency, and then they become collaborative and they start to agree upon what the cycle of improvement looks like. And then as you go into advancing, these schools or districts or organizations are moving towards they're moving in a motion of coordinating that continuous improvement. They're functioning now, and their policies and procedures are starting to kind of be formed more and more solid towards looking at the quantum and making sure that it's all student centered. And then at sustaining, teams are immersed in a systemic cycle of continuous improvement. So you've already arrived, and of course we never always arrive, but you're at a place where you can revisit, recycle, start over, and just make sure that you're looking at those continuous improvements, but as a cohesive team that has made decisions on how we're going to change our policy and our practice in order to benefit all of our students. So this is the continuum. And again, you can fluctuate on the continuum depending on which elements you have already been exposed or experienced to. And I want to pause because I want to give people an opportunity to throw questions in the Hoover app. And then Anne-Marie can help us by throwing those questions back out. And as we're developing and getting ready to look at those questions, I want to say that the continuum is definitely more fleshed out. This is just the basic continuum because in an hour we don't have time to kind of give you all of there is a phase for every single element that is already written out. It's still being developed, but it's already written out. And so you can kind of see where you are on the continuum. You have to come to the conference for that though.
Yeah, so something while those questions are being generated is if you look at it from exploring as being, we're just looking for cooperation at that point, right? We tend to overuse the term collaboration in our profession when things are not really being collaborative. Being told to do something and you doing it does not mean that you're collaborating, right? Collaborating is when you have a joint approach and are working together, and that doesn't come into play until that sustaining, advancing to sustaining. So you begin with just getting cooperation and understanding the mindset of everyone on board, because it's not about buy-in, it's about ownership. and really walking out the door and advocating for our students. So we want to make sure that we don't think lightly if we're in the exploring phase for a while. That preparation and emergence of the work has to take place. It's foundational. When we move into the coordinated efforts in emerging, that's where modifications can begin to be made as you're still developing towards the full-on collaboration. And transforming brings in more of that collective agreement, and modifications then occur at a more sustainable or a different level. But we go to advancing for active coordination and functionality. So we've got a foundation now to work from, and the work may become even quicker in some areas because it's the connections are being seen, and you're not just growing in your growth mindset, you're growing in growth mindset and in universal design for learning and in your response to intervention, say, because there's elements throughout all these 5 phases that relate, much like we looked at in the survey at the beginning that we're going to get to in a little bit. So when we move from that active coordination and we're in that functioning phase of advancing, that's when we go into sustaining, where we're more immersed and it's systematic and more maintainable. So you're maintaining more, you're taking more steps forward than you are backwards. We always look at when we're doing self-reflections on work, you might rate yourself quite high because you don't know what you don't know. And then as you begin to learn the nuances and the details of what it requires, you may score a little lower at your next interval because you realize the growth opportunities that you have that you didn't even know existed when you took the initial reflection. So there is a lot of work to do in developing our knowledge and skills and dispositions across these 5 phases. So let me see. We did not.
The whole goal is sustaining. The whole goal is sustaining equity.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Emery.
No questions came into the app, so.
All right, we will move forward. And so we have well, I'm not sure if at this point we can actually send people out to breakout sessions, but that was our hope. I don't know if we have the functionality, but if we do, we can send you out. Oh, we don't. So what we have is we have a pair squared anyway. I'm going to put the bit.ly in the chat just for those of you that would prefer to grab the bit.ly, and actually Emery already has it in there. So you can access the Padlet through either scanning it, or you can actually just click that and click the bit.ly and put it in your URL browser. And we have a couple questions for you. The questions are, how are you and your institution intentionally integrating the elements of Quantum 10? And then the next question is, how do you develop and secure supports that target academic and non-academic barriers to achievement through the intentional integration of the Quantum 10 elements? And so if you go to that bit.ly, which I will take us there too, so we can see as they come up, since we can't go out to breakout rooms, we have a plan for that. As you are accessing the bit.ly, I'll bring it up so that we can kind of see what we have going on there. So again, how are you and your institution intentionally integrating the elements of the Quantum 10, and how do you develop and secure supports that target academic and non-academic barriers? So you're welcome to click on the plus button and go ahead and get started. And we'll see those grow in live time.
Talisa, do you want to just go back to the screen so that they can access using a QR code if they choose to?
I do, thank you.
Thank you.
There we go. I see PBIS is intentional through their daily academic, PBIS frameworks, rubrics. Daily academic plans, excellent. And anyone else is welcome. You're welcome to how do you develop and secure supports. And even if you are not using all of the elements of the Q10, you can do as the two individuals here did. PBIS is intentional through our daily academic plans and instructional strategies. So they're listing the what elements they're using. So what element would you integrate with PBIS through your through your daily academic plans? So for the anonymous person, which one of the elements do you integrate with that? And someone says PD frameworks and rubrics. And if you can give us some, like, what does that look like? Like if I were gonna intentionally integrate some of the elements, I may be having a PBIS school-wide system, but within that, we're practicing restorative practices. And so basically, yes, the students have an expectation. Yes, there is a consequence, but the consequence is not punitive. It is possibly a restorative conversation. As well as if I'm going to integrate that with the culturally responsive practices, I'm going to be mindful that students come in with different cultural backgrounds. And so I'm going to ensure that I have some artifacts, if it's artifacts, or some sort of an opportunity for students to connect with me in the way they know how, in the way they experienced at home. And so not just saying, nope, you can't come, you look me directly in the eye. You know, make sure you look me directly in the eye. We know that some cultures see that as a sign of disrespect. So instead of saying, here are the expectations, and now we're going to have a restorative circle, but you need to look me directly in the eye, I'm going to ensure that I say, well, thank you. I do hear you. You know, I see you. I appreciate you. And there's a consequence still, but it's with the restorative pieces in mind, so that the consequence matches the behavior and that the students are actually learning to reflect versus just giving them a consequence, which is what was done to us as kids. We got a consequence. I didn't know why I was picking up trash. I just had to pick it up. If I did something wrong, or if I was late, I had to pick up trash. You know, so we're making sure that the consequences match the behaviors. So, it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat that haven't been addressed. Let's see if we can find it.
I have a question.
Thank you for that.
I have a question here that came in just after you started that engagement, so I didn't want to interrupt.
Okay, thank you.
But the question was from Elise, and she was asking, how can you sustain equity without a focus on race?
That's a great question. There are some elements of race that need to be addressed. You're right. You have to sustain equity. You have to really address that conversation too. And a lot of that can come in through the culturally responsive practices. There are a lot of frameworks, a lot of culturally responsive frameworks that actually talk about race. Courageous Conversations, they dig right into race. And so if you're talking about culturally responsive practices, you could actually use that framework. And that is when I say that's a great question, it absolutely is. And so if that's the framework that you will need for your school, then when you're looking at the culturally responsive piece, you're going to want to make sure that you're digging into one of those frameworks that clearly addresses race. And that is one of the things that, trust me, I know from firsthand experience that we do have to address that. A lot of our data shows that our students that are most historically underserved are students of color. You know, African-American students. The data for African-American boys shows that they are suspended 3 times as much as the other students. And for African-American girls, 6 times as much. So great question. And absolutely, you do need to address race in that.
Yeah, and I do think, if I can just tag along with that,
yeah.
Talisa, is when I was sharing about the Every Student Succeeds Act and the multi-tiered system of supports, that's rooted in, like, the reason why we have those provisions are to include and benefit all students, including students of color, low income students, English learners, students with disabilities, and those who are homeless or in foster care as examples. And I think that the fusion of, well, I know that the fusion of the Q10 builds in those practices. So you may not be in the immediate conversation of let's talk about race, but it's going to show up in your data, right? It's going to show up in your teaching evaluations. It's going to show up in your leadership practices. And that's something that I really appreciate about the 5 phases is the growth that it takes you through. not to do a pun for Carol Dweck, but we all can use a little growth mindset. And in areas that we may not even think are on our radar at all, but that we have to address in order to be more effective and efficient in how we support our students.
And I'll dig in a little bit more, because one of the things that I think that the person with the question might have alluded to too is that when we talk about equity, we're talking about race. And yes, we are, but there are also other elements. And there are, one of the things that I do for, for my day job is I do a conversation on real race talk. Some audiences are ready for real race talk, audience, they are. And others will shut down and close the door and won't hear you. That doesn't mean we don't talk about it. That just means that we're strategic about how we address race. And it's not to border white fragility, since we're going there. Not saying we have to be fragile and we have to make sure that people's feelings don't get hurt because we've used the word white or black or Latino. But what I'm saying is, if you want people to really truly hear your conversation and understand what you're saying, you have to make sure that they're ready for the conversation. We have spent years, 400 years or plus 200 years with a system that is still kind of evolving. And so to come in and slam people right away with what you want them to hear doesn't mean that they're going to hear it. It's even just like we also are individuals who need to hear conversation, need to understand how to get to that mindset of making sure we're leveling the playing fields. Because the reality is, when you talk about race and when you talk about leveling the playing field, somebody has to give something up in order to level that playing field. And if you're not ready for that, you might not want to hear that conversation. And if you are ready for that, let's go. I say, let's go. And I'm with you. So we want to, of course I want to, make sure that I'm slamming and talking about, but that's the whole reason why the culturally responsive practices piece, because schools and districts do have a right to select where they are. The Quantum 10 is not a cookie cutter. It's not where everyone gets this and that. It is, where are you on the continuum? If your school, I see a lot of PBIS, your school and districts, a lot of your schools and districts are probably already going towards the direction of sustaining when it comes to positive behaviors, interventions, and supports. So then I wouldn't come into your school and be like, well, we need to do more of this with positive behaviors, interventions, and supports. I would work with you on integrating some of the other elements in what you're already doing. And so that would include the culturally responsive practices. And for those of you that are ready for that race talk, you guys know what I'm talking about when you're talking about race. Some people are not ready for it. When you're ready for that race talk, we will dig right in. But if you're not ready for that race talk, we could be doing more damage than we could be doing good. So I hope that answers that one. And I'll put my contact information up, so whoever wants to reach out to me and dig in and ask more questions, or if you want to challenge my thoughts, I'm open for that, because this is all about growth. And I can only learn from you like you can learn from me, and we learn from each other, which is the reason why we like the engagement. But I do want to address some more of the questions. So hopefully I answered that.
Okay, so while we're pondering the discussion on that, the other question that came in, and I think my app is not in sync with the questions, so I apologize because I did not see them before I put the bit.ly in. So it says that many folks see restorative practices and PBIS as an either or choice. Can you expand upon the intentionality about including both as part of the Q10?
Yes, because the positive behaviors, interventions, and supports is more of a school-wide expectations. And so you want to make sure that we do set expectations for students, but with that by itself, a lot of times kind of seems like it's top heavy. It's like, we've given you the expectations, do it. If you don't, there's a consequence. Well, restorative practices comes in where you're saying we do have expectations on campus, but what we've probably done was we've included students as a part of the conversation when it comes to the expectations. It's not just set by me as the adult and you're the kid, you do what I tell you to do, but I've included you, I've included the community, I listen to what the families say as we develop our system for our expectations for positive behaviors, interventions, and supports. And when the behaviors are not adhered to, well, first of all, the students have agreed to it because they've been a part of the development process. And when it's not adhered to, there are consequences. They're not necessarily punitive consequences, which is what a lot of us have learned. They could be, they should be consequences that provide reflection. But then on top of that, it's from a restorative perspective. So there may be a community circle, where if there's some harm, it's looking at a system where harm has been done versus you're a bad kid and you did something wrong. So rather than blaming students and saying you're naughty, you're bad, go off to the principal's office, you're saying somebody was harmed because of your actions. What can we do to resolve that? And allowing for them to reflect on those behaviors, getting them together with the other students so that they can have a dialogue about what happened, what took place, and how can we move forward. So that is the reason why with the quantum, it's not either or, it's and.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that question. Any other questions? I'm glad we have the Padlet, because the Padlet it helped us to get some more questions out there. That was great.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we moving on?
Looks like it. Okay.
Emery.
So going back to that intentional integration, I had shared with you earlier, like we look at it like ESSA and MTSS brings in that Q10 fusion for policies, practice, procedures, professional learning. And that's because my years of experience and exposure has really taught me that we can have all of these elements present in our schools, but it's the effectiveness and the integration of them that changes the ownership over from us coordinating it and supporting our students and staff to them really owning it and living through a more cohesive educational opportunity. So when I look at 4 of the 6 critical elements of MTSS that relate are the multiple measures to assess school performance and progress, and resource and equity are the 2 of the 4 provisions from ESSA. I'm sorry, the 4 that related to what we were looking at with adaptive leadership was obviously leadership, but also database problem solving, capacity building with infrastructures, and data evaluation. And those relate specifically to the resources and equity and the multiple measures to assess school performance and progress from ESSA. And when we look into the Q10 continuum on data practices, they range across the 10 elements. And you took that survey before we began, at least 10 of you did. And, and what it does is it reveals our comfortability and admiration for data and takes us into deeper conversations, just like we were having about race, about equity, that can ensure that these systems are playing well together. So when I look at our data results, and I can share that with you, I think, yeah, right here. And I'm going to toggle back and forth between 2 tabs here. So let me get my screen set up so I can do that. I need to move that bar. Okay. And so when I look at our data results, I see us as being more emerging because we have a representation that has the different elements of database practices within adaptive leadership present, but the functionality isn't consistent. So if all 10 of you who did this survey were a part of a leadership team, where we would go to next is not necessarily those elements that are not at all in practice yet, because maybe you're not ready to get them integrated. You have to talk about your culture, your community involvement, your student culture, your expectations for students, those other elements that Talisa was speaking to. So if you decided to go into deeper conversations, you could look at the area of efficiently and routinely measuring, adjusting, and informing the impact of the 8 categories. You may also go into what is your campus offering in regards to a structured ongoing process to collect, reflect on, and use implementation and outcome data to inform the different practices. I'm going to toggle to just the questions here now, because if we're looking at including student-centered strategic and goal-directed opportunities through multiple provisions of action and expression that plan for physical action, expression, and communication and executive functions for our students, that can bring in multiple of the elements that can bring in, we were just talking about restorative practices, that can bring in inclusive practices, that can bring in how functioning is our PBIS. Is it that we check all of our boxes in regards to PBS being present, or are we missing gaps or clusters of students that we can do better for? And so looking at the data in this way, if we want to be immersed in a systematic cycle of continuous improvement that's maintained in our data practices of ensuring that we are including student-centered and strategic or goal-directed opportunities, then we need to make sure that we're looking at the strengths that we have going on in our campuses to build that from. So for us, we never felt like we had everything going on until we saw it become a sustainable practice within our students. And we saw it become a part of that culture, not just a culture that we were designing as leaders, but a culture that anyone who walked into the school could ask a teacher, a student, a parent, what are we going for here? And what are we working on? What are some areas that we're not so great at yet, but we're working on it? Because no one's perfect. And when that becomes a transparent practice, we have so much more going for us in lines of equity and sustainability than just checking the boxes off of having a system present or having the tools and resources available. It's the functionality that the fusion of the Q10 really brings to play. So I think where we're going to go next, because I see we have like 2 minutes. So if you want to go ahead, and I'll go here and just bring them to my screen, Talisa. We wanted to just let you all know that we're in the beginning stages of this work, and everybody's inputs and professional network and thought processes are really important, because as a nation, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to equity in education. And internationally, we have a lot to learn with and from each other. So coming up on December 8th, 9th, and 10th is the first ever Quantum 10 Equity in Education Conference. And we have some great keynote speakers like Douglas Reeves and Katie Novak, Dr. Talisa Sullivan herself, and many more. We have student teacher leadership panels that are going to be discussing equity in education, as well as practices from teachers and university personnel, school leaders, and consultants from in the field are going to be coming around the very important, I don't want to say topic, but practice that we need to be sure is in the forefront of everything we do in our profession. So we invite you all to join us. I think Talisa maybe added the link in the chat box, and we can go ahead and message that link to you after we finish through the app as well. But we welcome you to join us for that. And then I'm going to just move us forward real quick. I know that there is a survey within the app but we always like to improve. And so if you don't mind just taking a snapshot of the QR code, or if Talisa can put the bit.ly in the chat box. There's just a few questions that we had that we wanted to get your insights on so that we can continuously improve in our practices. And I'll leave that up just for a minute. But you also have in the app the presentation. And after this survey, we have our contact information, as well as a thank you to all of you for joining us. And I will go ahead and close us out with a quote. And then you're welcome to stay and hang with us as long as the platform doesn't kick us out. But the quote is that our society cannot afford a two-tiered system in which the affluent have access to superior education, while everyone else is subjected to a dull and incoherent classroom experience. Academic excellence, educational equity, and fairness demand a strong foundation of knowledge for all learners. And we truly believe that. So thank you for joining us. Talisa?
Thank you. Great job. And if we could just put up the slide where they can contact us, that would be great. If you have any other questions regarding the Quantum 10 or the conference that's coming up, you can contact myself, or you can contact Anne-Marie. We're both available for questions. And if you just want kind of dive deeper into the race talk or any other equity talk, we're looking forward to hearing from all of you all. Thank you. We've put everything in the chat. We appreciate all of you on today.